Hi, this is Don Cusic with the Music Biz, and today with me is Neil Rosenberg, who wrote The History on Bluegrass. It says Bluegrass, A History, but it's actually The History of Bluegrass, published by University of Illinois Press. Neil, you said that in the beginning of the book that it took you 10 years to write this. Does this mean that every day for 10 years you got up, went to your typewriter, and worked 8 hours?
No. Well, I signed the contract with the press to do the book in 1971.
Mm-hmm.
And various bits and pieces were written between then and 1982. But mostly what I did was research off and on. I was doing other things, gathering material and trying to figure out exactly what I was going to do with the book. And then I got a sabbatical, 82, 83, and I just guess I sat down, started working in about this time, right after my classes end in April up there at Memorial, and I started working then and finished it early January in 83, and then went through and did a revision and had a manuscript about April 83. So it was about a year of intense writing work.
Now you teach at University of Newfoundland.
Memorial University of Newfoundland, yeah.
And you teach folklore.
Yeah, we have a folklore department there.
And what is your writing schedule? Do you have a schedule for writing? Or?
I think most academics, I try and write, on weekends and on odd days, but most of the writing gets done, most of the serious writing gets done in those times when you're not teaching.
Mm-hmm.
But really, if you're going to write a book like this, you've got to have a free block of time. So what I did when I did this book, I was at home, and I'd get up early. I'm a morning person.
Mm-hmm.
I'd get up early and I'd write until noon anyway, and then maybe do research stuff, because I found writing it that you think you know, and then you find when you start going that there's something you don't know. And so I'd find myself going to Billboard or to back to Bluegrass Unlimited just to find details and facts and try and quantify things that I didn't really know, and so I'd do the research stuff then, and maybe then in the evening I'd write a little bit more, something like that.
Are you pretty much a first draft person? That it's got to be right the first time through? And
No, I'm not. And since then, I got myself a K-Pro, and I'm writing on the using word processing system, and I find that a great boon to get stuff. The way I write, I just pour it out, and I write I figured 10 pages in the morning is pretty good production for the way I write, and then it's got to be gone over. And I did a lot of cutting and cutting and Scotch taping with this thing in order to get to where I.
Did you throw a lot of things out that you'd written?
A fair amount, yeah. Details and so on. There's some things I wish I'd had space to do. I had one chapter I wrote that didn't get in there at all. I had a picture from that was taken backstage at Bean Blossom in about 1959, and it was a picture of 2 local guys and 2 members of Monroe's band. And I just happened to know who took the picture, and I kind of constructed this lovely ethnography and a sort of concentric circle thing. It was just too complicated and kind of arcane to fit into the book. And there were other things like that I thought was great, and then I realized they didn't really fit.
You mentioned Bill Monroe and Bean Blossom. Monroe's name is synonymous with bluegrass pretty much. And why didn't you just write a biography of Monroe? Well,
first of all, I think, I'd always thought that Ralph Rensler was going to do that, and I hope he does. Bill would want to be participating in something like that. In some ways, Bob Cantwell did it too, in his book, Bluegrass Breakdown. But I wasn't really interested in getting just into Bill Monroe and his music. And what interests me is what I wrote about here. The fact, not so much that Monroe created it, but that it got away from him. That, you know, that seems to me what's interesting about it, and that it became an idea that people felt was worth fighting for. And
Why is Bill Monroe so important? You mentioned that he created it.
Yeah. Well, Bill Monroe is important for this music because he saw it as a personal art form. And several people have told me this. I think Owen Bradley, when I was doing that Bill Monroe discography, you know, Owen Bradley said, well, we didn't really understand what was going on with Bill Monroe, that, you know, and there's a group of anomalous sessions that Monroe did for Decca in 1951 with the standard studio musicians, you know, with electric guitar and drums and so on. And they were a real disaster. And Owen Bradley said, well, then it was then that I realized that Bill Monroe was like Guy Lombardo or something like that. He had his sound. He knew what he wanted. And the job of the producer was to make sure that he achieved what he wanted to achieve in the recording studio, which is not the way that most producers operate. They're much more intrusive these days. And dictatorial, yeah. And Monroe still will not stand for that. And so that's why bluegrass exists as it does. He takes these often young musicians and he fits them into his mold.
You mentioned the personal integrity that Monroe felt for his music. He had that vision for it that nobody else had.
Yes. Yeah. He just, he knows what he wants, and he has a way of getting people to do what he wants.
You mentioned about being in the band. Why does every bluegrass picker want to be a member of Bill Monroe's band?
Well,
is it like going to Harvard?
Yeah, it's an educational process. Yeah, you know, I played a few times with him. I never was a regular member of his band or traveled with him, but I was at his park in Bean Blossom. I worked there in various capacities, and occasionally he'd show up without a banjo player. First time this happened, I mean, I didn't know anything about his music, or I knew a little, but I didn't know most of his repertoire, and you know, I was scared to death, and he didn't speak to me or anything. But when I got on stage and started playing with the band, he got up there and stood beside me and played all kinds of weird rhythms right in my ear. You know, I thought he was trying to throw me, but I understood later from what other people said and from what he did that he was trying to beat the rhythm into me, get me to play the right rhythm. And he did this in various ways. He'd lay all kinds of interesting trips on people that played with him, you know, in order to get them to do what he wanted. He'd let them play far out stuff, and then all of a sudden he'd jump on them, and you know, he's a master of psychological warfare in that sense.
So he's as much of a teacher as he is a musician.
Quite definitely. Oh yes, yeah, he is.
You know, one of the things that seems to me unique about bluegrass is that, well, in country and rock, the writers and scholars are not supposed to be able to play or sing or any of that kind of stuff, whereas bluegrass, if you don't play, the attitude is you shouldn't be writing about this music. You shouldn't be researching it. And I know you play.
I play. I think, I don't think that there's that, you know, I certainly don't mind people writing about it who haven't played it and so on, as long as they do the research and, you know, are sincere.
But the attitude seems to be you can't really appreciate it unless you could pick up the guitar or banjo or fiddle or something and do a break.
Well, the thing is, the people who have written about it have historically been musicians and see it from that point of view, and so they've very much shaped what's written about the music. And do
you think it's made a major difference between bluegrass research
and country
and country and others?
I think so. I think that the people who write about bluegrass write from this sort of interior point of view, and they often, I was just talking with Paul Wells about this last night, that if you look at it not as a musician but as somebody who's trying to market the music, as he did, he worked for CMH, or you know, I've done that too, and I've worked, I have a radio program right now, managed Bean Blossom, you realize that the people who come to listen to this music don't listen to it with the same kind of perceptions that people who perform it or that the fans do, that they're not really interested in the hot banjo breaks and you know, all these little details that the fans and enthusiasts are interested in. So that's made a difference, because the people who've written about bluegrass have emphasized those kind of in-group preoccupations, even when the people who came to listen to the music, maybe they wanted to hear the songs and the lead singers and so on, weren't so interested in, you know, whether or not they had an electric bass or, you know, things of that sort.
You mentioned in the book and a lecture that you gave that the term bluegrass came from Bill Monroe's band name, the Bluegrass Boy, but yet Monroe never used the name. I mean, used that term for a number of years. How did bluegrass become identified with the term with the music?
Well, I don't think we'll ever know exactly what happened. But there are a number of things probably happening at the same time. First of all, Bill used that word not only for his band, but he used it, you know, the bluegrass special was his bus, and he had a number of instrumentals that were bluegrass this and bluegrass that. So he used it as a trademark and an image. And but then, to me, what seems the crucial piece of evidence, and this comes from one person really, Everett Lilly, who played mandolin with Flatt and Scruggs back in the early 50s. And Everett Lilly says that fans would come up to Lester or Earl and say, would you boys play some of those old songs, those old duets? And they wouldn't want to mention Monroe's name, because they knew that Flatt and Scruggs and Monroe were not on speaking terms. And so they would say, would you play some of those old bluegrass songs, as a kind of a code word. So that's the explanation. And that's how it seems to have started, and, from fans that knew what was going on and liked that thing. And then, however it started, it gradually spread. It's important, I guess, that the people who used that word at first probably didn't take it that seriously. You know, it was like when they first heard it, they might laugh and say, oh, of course, you're bluegrass, you know, like Bill Monroe. They would see the connection because they knew all that. And it was not thought of as a word that demanded an explanation. It was just a word like you'd use as a kind of maybe you'd say, instead of saying Waylon Jennings, you'd say outlaw music. But when it got into the folk revival, and these young people like myself who didn't know all of this stuff thought that word demanded an explanation, it had some sort of intellectual construct behind it. And that's really where then the change occurs. That's when the word starts to take off.
You mentioned that, well, of course, Monroe's known as the father of bluegrass, and your book intimates that bluegrass is a family, and there's been some pretty severe family quarrels amongst bluegrass, with the Flatt and Scruggs splitting and with the Monroe splitting. That's had major effects on the growth of bluegrass, hasn't it? The family squabbles, the traditional versus the new grass, all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it just goes on and on. People are always, well, it's, I mentioned, I guess, also that there's I use the metaphor of the idea of limited wealth or limited good, which is something anthropologists have kicked around. And you really do get a feeling that a lot of this is when you get away from the personalities and so on, that this is a product of a situation in which there's just so much of a market, and disagreements often move very quickly into economic competition. Fights over things like who recorded the song first. You know, that Monroe being leaving Columbia because Columbia signed the Stanley Brothers, who had recorded Molly and Ten Brooks. You know, that classic example, and there are lots of other ones. There was a point.
Is it more that than it is personalities, or do you think it's the personalities that?
Well, I think there are personalities that are often just how shall I say, not so much specific personalities, but a personal tendency to quickly take offense at what they see as a stepping over
what
bounds.
I was getting, I was going to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
When all the splits generally come from Monroe, who is the head. So, is his personality such that it's hard for him to get along with people that don't agree with him totally?
Well, I think so. I think Bill has a real dilemma. I mean, and it goes on right now down to the present about is this his music and his personal property, or is this something that has grown beyond him? And Bill's band turnover reflects not only the pressure of the road, but the fact that eventually guys have had enough of that teacher-student relationship, and they want to move on, and so that is an effect that's important there. But you see it in other ways. I mean, guys fall out over who's going to be booked where, and who's getting what percentage of this and that, and it's a very small pie. These guys are all working to try and get bigger cut of, and so it's like, in another way, is like a religious sect in which you get people fighting each other more than other religions, I mean, that's very often the way it is in these situations. So there are a lot. I think there's no real easy explanation, but a lot of them.
Yeah. I think the most fascinating chapter in your book is chapter 6, which is the link between bluegrass and the folk music revival. How did that briefly come together? I mean, how did the folk revival help bluegrass?
Well, the folk revival helped bluegrass by taking it out of clubs and by putting it on albums and into college campuses, and bringing it to an entire new market, a market that was younger, that was more highly educated and had more capital.
Did it make it hip, in a sense?
Yeah, for a while, and it's interesting. This is interesting. The response in Nashville to this was one of consternation, because at the very point that bluegrass started to come to the attention of the revivalists, and this took place over a long period of time. I mean, the folk revival was a real kind of a cult thing starting in the 40s in New York City and a few other urban places, and so the first people who were trying to play like Earl Scruggs on the banjo were doing it before 1950, but it didn't really start to kind of gather mass and momentum until the middle 50s, and didn't come really to the attention of the bluegrass musicians themselves until 58, 59, and so on.
Well, ironically, Monroe got left behind for a while.
At the start, he did. Yeah, it was Flatt and Scruggs who and then the Stanley Brothers who were first recognized and first, got the bookings and got all the kudos and so on. But Monroe was bound to end up on top because of the fact that he was the most authentic and at the root of it all. So it eventually led to the festival movement. In fact, I don't think you can see the current position of bluegrass now without that revival, that impetus that led to the festival movement.
And the festivals came out of the Woodstock generation that wanted festivals, that wanted the not just a musical gathering, but a gathering, a happening.
Yeah. Well, in a sense, they contributed to it because they really came out of the Newport. They were a spin-off from the Newport Folk Festival, and they were just really catching on as Woodstock started. That was '69. The first bluegrass festival was in '65, and so there was a real overlapping there. Bluegrass festival. For a lot of those people, the bluegrass festival was no different from a rock festival. I mean, you know, it didn't matter that the instruments weren't rock instruments. You know,
it was background music anyway.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, there are certain figures in bluegrass that are. Well, when you mention bluegrass to people who are on the fringe, you've just heard a little bit, these names come up. I want you to tell me why. Flatt and Scruggs, why are they so important?
Well, they were the most popular and widely heard bluegrass band of all time. And they were popular because and most widely heard. They were on a major label. They were on the Opry, and they were probably Scruggs was definitely the most influential single instrumentalist, and Flatt is now people are coming to recognize the fact that he was the most important lead singer and also a songwriter, and together they had a because of their contract with Martha White, they had a economic stability and a solid audience that allowed them to maintain a very high profile and a good band, and you know, to keep things going steadily.
You mentioned TV and movie exposure that,
yes.
that they got before anybody else got.
Yeah, and then they wrote on this plateau. They took advantage because of Louise Scruggs, who was who understood and was enthusiastic about the folk revival, and saw it as a way of combating the hillbilly stereotype, and kind of turning upside down the perception which Nashville had of bluegrass in the late '50s, which was the hick of the hickest and the stuff that we needed to get rid of. She saw and successfully turned upside down that whole idea, and said, "Look at the hippest people in the country. These young college students at these prestigious universities are listening to this music," and the Beverly Hillbillies thing helped them that way, and so all of this gave them just a tremendous advantage in terms of reaching out.
Okay, another name. You always hear guitar players say Clarence White.
Okay.
Why was he so important?
Well, Clarence White is an interesting individual. Of course, he died in 1973 very tragically, and before he'd done that, he'd played with the Kentucky Colonels with his brother and so on out of L.A. And while that band was actually in existence, which is in the early '60s basically, they never really made it as a group. They did play at Newport and so on, and they had a couple of records, but they were never as popular, say, as the Dillards, who were active in the same market at the same time. But then he went to play with the Byrds, and it's really, I think, a kind of a feedback. It's a historical feedback. Now Clarence White is recognized as the person who is the guitar, the godfather or the spiritual ancestor of Tony Rice and every other guy who plays any lead guitar, and that comes from the fact that he was doing this kind of fantastic lead guitar work at an early point, and then that he went into the Byrds and Nashville West and did all this interesting electric stuff, which made people aware of him. So it's very much a sort of a posthumous thing.
Now Scruggs' influence comes from his technical ability on the banjo.
Technical, I guess, but being a banjo player and influenced by him, I think that technical doesn't really tell at all. I mean, he's really was an artist, or is an artist, you know, that was able to transcend the technical ability and communicate.
But the point I was making, but you seem to be saying that White's influence is more, I hate to use the word spiritual, but it wasn't so much his mastery of the instruments as the people he...
Well, he had a mastery of the instrument, but whereas Scruggs immediately reached out to all kinds of listeners, and you know, you get stories from banjo players about the first time they heard Earl Scruggs. The people who were influenced by Clarence White were first influenced by others who were influenced by Clarence White. So you had Clarence White at the center, and then you had other people who were influenced by him, but they were a lot of them were from California or from Boston, where he hung out, you know, and then it spread out from that, and only after people had heard, well, Clarence White is the person that's responsible for this style, did you start to get a demand for recordings by the Kentucky Colonels and an interest in trying to find everything that Clarence White ever did at a live show, which is what you've got now is hundreds, well, not hundreds, but you have lots of LPs of Clarence White. So Clarence White was very much an underground figure in that sense. Okay,
on the business side of bluegrass, the name Carlton Haney comes up. Why was he important, or why is he important?
Well, Carlton, his most important act was to create the first bluegrass festival. But before that, Carlton had taken over the management of Don Reno and Red Smiley, a band that started recording for King in 1951 but was unable to make a go of it from 51 through, or 52 I guess it is, through to 55, a period that was pretty good times for country music, but then all of a sudden in 56, which is 55 and 56 when the rockabilly thing is coming on and country music is hurting, they started to make a go of it. They came together, and Carlton Haney just took that band, and from that period, from about 56 through 64, just really did wonders with that band in booking them and managing them. And they could have, if they had wanted to, they could have been on the Opry and gone on, you know. It was just too much for, basically, Red Smiley's health wouldn't allow it, and they split up. So he was an excellent manager and promoter, and he did a lot of other stuff that wasn't bluegrass at all. He did a lot of promoting in the Carolinas and up into Maryland, Virginia, in that area. So he was an excellent promoter. And he just got onto this festival idea and knew how to take advantage of it, knew how to make the contacts. And
Didn't he figure out how bluegrass could make money?
well, I guess he did, yeah, through the festival thing, and I think he was surprised, as everyone else was, at the way in which it took off. He happened in some ways to be at the right place in the right time. And he found that these festivals would work and it could make money.
Before your book came along, nobody really gave Louise Scruggs credit for anything other than being, I suppose, Earl Scruggs' wife, but yet she's got a prominent part in your book and in the history of bluegrass. Why is she important? Why do you want to give her this credit?
Well, as I said earlier, I think that I feel that if she had not been managing Flatt and Scruggs, they would not have, I think, been able to take advantage of this folk revival interest. I think she perceived the way in which this could be used to make Flatt and Scruggs not just hillbillies who were selling flour, but you know, important folk artists. And she took advantage of that very, very cleverly. And not only that, but she was a good manager and a good promoter and publicist. And she wasn't working for anybody but Flatt and Scruggs. Whereas you can say that for very few other groups. Well, you know, Colonel Tom was working for Elvis in that way and so on. But she was able to handle the business of that group in a way that was most efficient and worked for them. And I think it's worth pointing out. I think also that I'm trying to counteract the sort of innuendo that you find in the bluegrass business about Louise. You know, people blame her for changing the sound of Flatt and Scruggs, and they blame her for this and that. Well, it's true that she did play a role in the repertoire and so on, but I really feel it ought to be viewed more positively than it has. She's responsible for one of their best LPs, the Carter Family LP. You know, and she, as we were talking a little earlier, she's one of these people who was knew what was going on in the music, but wasn't a musician herself. And she perceived, I think, a larger audience than just the hardcore bluegrass fans. And to the extent that the albums sold well, the LPs, the concept LPs they did, sold well, she played a role in spreading their popularity.
You've said that the festivals are the major thing for bluegrass expanding, and yet Flatt and Scruggs didn't play many festivals because of the problems with Monroe, not really wanting to share a stage. How could Flatt and Scruggs grow outside, and bluegrass grow outside the festivals? Well,
we're talking really about two different periods of time, because Flatt and Scruggs' greatest popularity came in the early and mid-'60s. And they were just not in a position to take advantage of the festivals. By the period when the festivals were beginning to become popular, see, the first festival started in '65. Flatt and Scruggs, at that point, they didn't need a festival. They didn't need to come to these little, what were still very small events. And they couldn't fit on because the early Haney festivals were really rituals, you know, celebrating Bill Monroe as the center figure, and Flatt and Scruggs didn't fit in to that because they had split and they were going their own way. And by 1968, 69, when it would have been possible, they did play a few festivals. It would have been possible for them to fit back into the festival thing as it got bigger and bigger. They themselves were at loggerheads over whether to follow the path of their recordings, you know, doing more and more of these Bob Dylan songs and so on, the kind of stuff that Flatt didn't like, and, you know, using Scruggs' sons on the records and so on. They were fighting about that, and they just weren't in no position to take advantage of that when it happened.
You brought up something interesting. I know you teach about traditional folk songs or folk song development. And it seems to be a big split in bluegrass, or at least there was, between where songs should come from. Flatt and Scruggs seem to introduce new songwriters, whereas is it still that way in bluegrass that you should stick to the traditional material? Where does the songwriter fit in with bluegrass?
Well, I think that's an area of great debate. I suppose that the kind of the central or conventional position now is that bluegrass is more a methodology than the form with a specific repertoire, although in fact there is sort of a standard repertoire, songs that everyone knows and plays. But for the bands, if you look at it in terms of somebody who's trying to market the music and so on, the problem is finding material. Where do you find material? Do you go back? You know, all these bands have done different things. You go back and you find old B-sides or obscure stuff that's real good that nobody knows about, or you write new material. And bluegrass is, I think, traditionally not paid enough attention to the creation of new material. Well, I was talking, Paul Wells and I were talking about this too last night, that the most influential bluegrass performances came in the period between 46 and 56 in terms of the material. Preponderance of the songs that are still considered the standards and the most important songs come from that period, and that coincides with Bill Monroe's most creative songwriting. And he was...
But weren't a lot of Monroe's songs traditional songs that he had his name on?
No, not a lot, no. No, Monroe's most important and influential songs were songs that he wrote or Lester Flatt wrote or they wrote together. And Lester Flatt wrote a lot of songs that were important. Carter Stanley wrote a lot of songs, and various others. And those songs are still the most important songs for your kind of garden variety bluegrass bands.
Well, you know, when you look at the history of bluegrass, you've got Earl Scruggs on the banjo, Clarence White on guitar, Bill Monroe on mandolin, defining that genre. But you don't really have a songwriter, do you? Or do you?
Well, I think that if there is a songwriter, it is Monroe or it is Flatt or Carter Stanley. Those are the three who've written the most songs that are standards that people hark back to, and they're very well crafted songs. I think that this is a point that Ricky Skaggs has made very convincingly, that there are good songs. Jim Eanes has written some, you know, I mean, he's gone back and picked out songs from the old bluegrass repertoire and pointed out the way in which those songs are not just bluegrass songs, and at least in theory, a good bluegrass song should be a good song, not just a bluegrass song. And one of the problems is that people write songs for bluegrass thinking too much of the genre and not enough about what the song ought to be. And that is a problem.
Is that why so many songs from rock are adopted? Fox on the Run.
Fox on the Run.
It was a rock song.
Yeah. There's a tradition of going that way, of borrowing from other genres, but I don't think that's any different from what happens in most of country music. Yeah,
bluegrass seems to be more open to doing songs that come from other sources, whereas country seems to be very insistent that the song come from somewhere and never be recorded before.
Yeah.
Whereas bluegrass, you'll see the same song on a number of albums once it gets popular.
That's right. Yeah, and reflects the fact that this is a kind of ongoing tradition,
Mm-hmm.
and that it is the distance between the grassroots and the upper levels
Mm-hmm.
is not that far in bluegrass as it is in country, because it's a smaller scene. But yeah, there's been borrowing of that sort, especially I would say since with the folk revival. I think that with the folk revival and what Flatt and Scruggs did, you know, turning to Woody Guthrie and
Mm-hmm.
and seeing in this material a possibility. The country gentlemen are very important in that way. They were the first to do, and the Dillards, to
Mm-hmm.
do Bob Dylan songs and to borrow from unlikely sources and to go back to old pre-war country music, old hillbilly recordings, and
Mm-hmm.
and redo them. And then,
Has anybody emerged as a definitive fiddle player? I know there have been so many fiddle
Yeah.
players, but like Monroe on mandolin and Scruggs
Mm-hmm.
on banjo.
well, Chubby Wise was very important with
Mm-hmm.
with the band, but it's hard to say. Different people have different favorites. I think historically, you know, you've got Chubby Wise. Benny Martin
Mm-hmm.
was really crucial in the early Flatt and Scruggs era. I think Byron Berline has had a lot of influence in recent years. Bobby Hicks with Monroe in the 50s, and then back again with Skaggs. Kenny Baker, perhaps, especially a few years ago, people would say, well, Kenny Baker is the bluegrass fiddler, but there are a number of very good and very influential people on fiddle.
How about, well, it's tough with fiddle because there's so many old fiddle tunes that have, you know, come through. But how about dobro? Has anybody emerged there?
Oh, well, I think there's no doubt that Buck Graves is the influential person, and he definitely was the first, and that was a very conscious move. Flatt and Scruggs brought him into their band in 1955 in an attempt to move away from the sound of other bluegrass bands, and because Scruggs liked that sound, reminded him of Roy Acuff. So that's definitely comes directly out of the Flatt and Scruggs band and out of Cousin Josh, and then you've had a couple others come on since then, Mike Aldridge and Jerry Douglas. Those are the kind of the subsequent generations in that.
How about bass? Is anybody, or is that just in the background?
Well, no, there have been a couple of very influential bass players. Tom Gray with the Country Gentlemen. And George Shuffler, who played bass with the Stanley Brothers and with Reno and Harrell for a while. These guys are were real hotshot bass players. And there seems to be debate amongst bluegrass musicians and fans about whether you want a bass player who just goes boom, 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 or whether you want somebody who's going boom, 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 like that. There's a real disagreement, and the ones that are a little fancier are like Gray and Shuffler. Others are not so. I mean, there are many good bass players who play a much more sort of basic bass. Then you've got your latest electric bass players, and people still don't know what to make of the electric bass. They don't really.
But hasn't that become more of a fact in studios? Studio recording, the electric bass, because you get the cleaner sound as opposed to the noise of the stand-up?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, that's part of it. But a lot of those guys try and make their bass sound like an acoustic bass. They'll do all kinds of things to push it that direction, because it's easier to play, it's easier to carry around. You don't have all the miking problems. It's more volume in a live performance. It's the instrument they know how to play. So I think that it's more of a convenience thing than a studio thing, especially now, because in the studio, geez, with mics and so on, with the right producer, you can do almost anything you want with any instrument.
Lead singers. I know, well, Monroe with his harmony singing, especially, and Lester Flatt with his lead singing. Are there other lead singers that have defined, that are definitive singers in bluegrass?
Mac Wiseman. I think Mac Wiseman is somewhat underrated as an influential musician during that formative period in the early and mid-50s.
Are you talking about the time he spent with Monroe, or are you talking about the time outside?
No, Mac Wiseman, if you go back like into the period between about 1954 and 1956, he was at the top of the charts as far as bluegrass is concerned. His records were the ones that people were buying, and he really had a tremendous influence in those early years, and I think not accepted or recognized as much as it ought to be. So Mac Wiseman I would put as one of the most important. Carter Stanley.
Mm-hmm.
Who else? Red Smiley. They, I think, well, Jimmy Martin
Mm-hmm.
has also had a tremendous influence. Charlie Waller, the Country Gentleman. But Wiseman, I would say, and
Mm-hmm.
Flatt are probably, and Stanley are probably the three most important lead singers.
You mentioned in here about, you had a whole chapter, or most of a chapter, on religion, and you said something to the effect that it was more, with religion amongst bluegrass people, it was more style than substance.
Yeah.
That there's a certain way it's got to be presented, and really the content of the song is not what they're interested in. They're not interested in a religious experience. It's kind of touching base. You want to elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. It's an interesting situation. But, I think that until you get groups like the Lewis family and these all gospel groups, that basically what you had was a situation in which this was a religious within a secular, a sacred format within a secular format, and so the point was to do it more or less as a ritual, kind of like you know, going to church on Sunday is part of the rest of the week in that sense. So that I think people they sing songs. I mean, most of those bluegrass gospel songs are about fundamentalist topics, but they are songs which are performed in a very straightforward, impersonal way, often contrasting with the comedy routine, which would come in another part of the show.
And you also mentioned that the backsliding was as accepted as the religious commitment amongst these performers and amongst this world, in this world.
Well, I think that's part of, you know, it's part of sort of the accepted view of country religion in the rural South. But some of the people were very, very sincere about the music, and others were less so. But it was part of what you did, and you know,
it was roots.
That was roots, and it was also part of the show. I think you have to recognize that bluegrass, as a performance form, was a kind of theater, and this was part of the presentation. You had your comedy, you had your religion, you had your new recordings, you had all of these things had a place in the show and were expected, and it grew out of kind of the format of country music that started on the radio in the 30s and stage performances and so on.
Is that concept of theater still strong today amongst the newer bluegrass groups?
I think I get a feeling that it's coming back. That guys, for example, one of the things that happened in the 70s was you had all of a sudden a single mic for everybody. And now you see groups like the Johnson Mountain Boys doing their harmony around a single mic, so you get more movement on stage, and people talk with great nostalgia about how wonderful the choreography was in Flatt and Scruggs, which I don't know if you ever saw them live, but you know, these guys be standing way over there, and time for their break, and
dip into the mic,
and it had a lot of visual impact, and people are realizing that that's fun, that the audience enjoys seeing that, and so that idea of theater is coming back. I think that comedy routines have yet to be rediscovered, or people haven't dealt with the problem that comedy routines expressed values and ideas that aren't generally acceptable now to most audiences.
How do people find out about bluegrass today? Still a lot of festivals? I'm talking about people, you know, who haven't heard bluegrass. How would they be exposed to it?
Festivals play an important role. There are a lot of small, once-a-week radio programs on FM stations run by people like myself, and you know,
is this mostly college radio and public radio, or is this commercial radio?
There's a lot of college and public radio in the United States, FM everywhere, but also you know, some small private stations as well. So there's a lot of that going on, and people are exposed that way. It tends to be a word-of-mouth thing.
Are there any all bluegrass radio stations?
There are several in the Washington, D.C. area that come close, but I don't know of any all bluegrass radio stations.
How about TV?
Less so, as far as I know, on TV. There's the odd show here and there, but I think that, in fact, the impact of TV came in the 60s. Flatt and Scruggs had syndicated shows, Jim and Jesse, who else? The Lewis family. There were a number of syndicated shows. Reno and Harold had one. I don't know that there's that much going on of that sort today.
How about the print media?
Well, bluegrass has been well served by the print media in the music business. And I think there's the fact that it's recognized as a distinctive genre means that journalists feel, well, you've got to do a bluegrass story every once in a while. And there's always this, well, bluegrass is coming back sort of story that you get every once in a while. And so it's constantly being covered. It gets
hasn't the backbone of bluegrass in the media come from magazines like Bluegrass Unlimited, Fretz, Pickin', Yule Skinner News?
Oh yeah, yeah. These have definitely supported the music, but these tend to be magazines that people who know about the music know about, and others don't. They're very much for the convert. You're not going to find a lot of people who pick up these things on the newsstands and say, "I wonder what this is about."
How many people do they reach?
Well, Bluegrass Unlimited advertises or tells their advertiser that they have a readership of 60, 70,000, something like that.
Now, is that the circulation times 4?
I think so. I think that's what that is. Fretz is the larger circulation, considerably larger, but I don't know.
Now, you write for these magazines, don't you?
Bluegrass Unlimited, I do a monthly column for them called 30 Years Ago this month. And
did that research help with your book?
It's research that I'd been doing for a long time. It helped with the book, but in a sense, that was raw material that I couldn't really use in the book. And I had it for a long time, and I just got to talking with Pete Kuykendall, the editor, and said, look, why don't we do this? I remembered there's a similar kind of a column in Road and Track, and I used to read Road and Track all the time. And also there was a radio show, You Were There, that I used to hear when I was a kid, and I thought, well, those are interesting things. That'd be a lot of fun and be a way of getting this stuff out that I know the enthusiasts enjoy.
Do you have enough material for another book?
I don't know that I do right now on bluegrass. I don't know if I have enough energy to pull it all in that direction, but people have been saying to me, why don't you just take those columns and publish them? And so that's something I hadn't thought about.
So when are they coming out?
I don't know. I haven't got that far.
Where's bluegrass sold today?
Where it's sold, first of all, at festivals. It's marketed, the records are marketed, I think, mainly by mail order and in specialty stores. You go into your average record store, and you might find a bluegrass bin. And it might actually have some bluegrass in it, but the people who buy the most bluegrass records buy them from Dave Freeman and from Down Home Records and from people like this who sell mail order.
How many would a successful album sell?
A successful album would sell over 10,000, I would say, and a really successful album would sell over 20,000.
Is it like, was it Sonny Osborne said that there are 14,000 bluegrass fans in the country because that's how many albums they sell every time they release one? Well, is it something like that? Is that the record buying public?
I think it is. It's somewhere there between 10 and 20,000 people who.
Most of that comes from the festival sales?
Well, no, I don't think so. I think the people who come to festivals are the people who buy the records, but I don't know that they buy them all at festivals. I think they buy them in various ways.
Okay. And this leaves the custom record business quite prevalent in bluegrass. Aren't there a whole lot of groups out there that cut a little record and go sell it? And
oh, yeah, a lot of people.
Kind of like the gospel industry.
Yes, it's very similar. Yeah, people sell out of the trunk and off the stage.
Is this how new bluegrass groups are developed, are found?
Yes, yeah, sure. The first, the Johnson Mountain Boys, their first record was done by Gary Reed, who'd never done anything like that before, and it was an EP, you know, and it was, they produced it and sold it, and then Gary Reed has subsequently gone on to work for County Records and so on, and the Johnson Mountain Boys went to Rounder. Yeah, that's the way it's gone, yeah, for most of these groups.
What's the best bluegrass band today?
Well, gosh, I like the Johnson Mountain Boys. I like them because I like their show, and you know, it's kind of, they project a good feeling. Quicksilver, I haven't seen the new Quicksilver. I really like the old Quicksilver. Who else? Geez, there are groups around that you know, I don't even really know. I love the Forbes family's gospel recordings. I think they're great. I've never seen them, but I like their recordings a lot. But you know, that's a matter of taste. I don't want to sound like I'm
okay, well, let me hit close to home.
Okay.
Outside of yourself and Earl Scruggs, who's the best banjo player?
The best banjo player, I guess I'd have to say Bela Fleck. I think he's the one that's really doing interesting things today. But I mean, then you want to, you know, historically Earl Scruggs. I could go on and on about who's really good. Don Stover I always liked a lot. Eddie Adcock is just as good as he ever was. There are many good ones, but Fleck's the one that everybody's listening to and saying, "Wow, I wish I'd thought of that."
Okay. Well, Neil, thanks for sharing your time.
You're very welcome.
And I appreciate you talking to me.
Okay.
This is Don Cusic with the Music Biz.